Galef is the Communications Director for the Secular Student Alliance, prior to which he also worked for the Secular Coalition of America, for America, and the American Humanist Association. He has been extremely instrumental here in Columbus in providing content and information and inspiration for the Columbus Rationality group as well. Has worked with other religious organizations in North Carolina, where he graduated from UNC Chapel Hill in political science. In his spare time, he likes to read, breakdance, play board games, and also works on the Measure of Doubt blog with his sister, Julia Galef, who is the president and co-founder of the Center for Applied Rationality, an organization dedicated to helping people to make better decisions by not only identifying the cognitive bugs in the system of our brains, but learning how to actually overcome them. She is a public speaker and writer, has written for many publications, including Science, Scientific American, the Philosopher's magazine, and others, and gives talks about rationality and also co-hosts the Rationally Speaking podcast put on by the New York City Skeptics. Please give him a big welcome.
How would you like to do this? Would you like to shout while I use a microphone?
No, just
All right.
tapping into the microphone. This is the first time we've done a joint speech together, so it's an experimental format for us.
So I thank you all for being here and for inviting us and welcoming us. I've really enjoyed being a member of the humanist community of Central Ohio since moving here. My sister is running away. I hope okay, good. And it's been almost 4 years since coming to Columbus and immediately being immersed in the strong humanist and secular communities here with the Secular Student Alliance, which was my employer, but also a great group of people. I think, Skeptics group, which is sort of formed into the humanist community of Central Ohio, and of course, been a member of HCCO and was on the board for 1 year. But we're here to talk about some things that money can't buy, some important ways to find happiness and make the world a better place. But since it's the holiday season, I hope you'll indulge me for a little bit if I get sentimental and talk about our parents. I think it'll give you some sense of where we come from, what went wrong. And the best place to start is to tell you that our father used to, what's the phrase, tell us things that were not true.
I prefer to think of it as keeping us on our toes.
Yes, keeping us on our toes. It's not that he was a compulsive liar, he just liked to amuse himself. If you think of Calvin and Hobbes, the father of Calvin, describing, well, the sun is only about as big as a quarter, you can tell by holding it up. And when it lands, it doesn't crush people, it just turns the rocks red in Arizona where it lands. This is the sort of thing that he used to say. And Julia and my mom and I would have to stop and think, is that right? And we had to make it a deal. We banded together, Julia, my mom and I, and asked him point blank, if we asked you, is this true, he would have to be honest, and he would tell us the truth. But otherwise, anything was fair game. So we got...
He bargained us up to twice. If we asked him twice, he had to tell the truth. If we only asked him once, he would continue to lie.
Inflation is a problem. But this did instill some good habits in us. An intellectual curiosity, some skepticism. If we heard something that sounded a little off, we were practiced thinking, maybe I should look that up, maybe I should check this. But of course it couldn't be that simple. He would also do the reverse and tell us true things with an outrageous framing. The example that Julia has given is that when she was 7 or 8, our dad told us that he had made her a sandwich made with peanut butter and something that had been regurgitated by an insect. Obviously, this is horrifying to a small child. But yes, indeed, it's honey. And so even if something seemed absurd, we learned to realize that it might sound crazy, but it could be true. And we need to look for evidence, look for reasons that it could make sense. Besides the playfulness and intellectual curiosity, our parents did instill good habits in us with methods besides deception. Sometimes they used bribery. We had a rule for bedtime, that 9 o'clock was bedtime, and if we were in our rooms reading, we could stay for an extra half hour until 9:30. So, it was clear we were already reading all the time. We actually were antisocial and read at the dinner table, which they accepted. I don't know if it was grudgingly or enthusiastically. But in case it's not clear, with this kind of use of incentives, both of our parents were economists. They actually ended up working for competing consulting firms. And one of the things that I like to say is that every now and then at the dinner table, they would say, "Oh, honey, what'd you do at work today?" I can't tell you. So one of the things that we did learn, though, from being the children of economists is the importance and value of trade-offs and really examining what the values were at play. They did a lot of work consulting for the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, discussing how to set air pollution policy. One policy might be a little more expensive and demand more innovations, have coal plants change their smokestacks, if that's what coal plants have, and emit less sulfur dioxide, for example. And this might kill maybe 1% fewer people. And we'd have to figure out, is that worth it? And so they had to find some way to set a value on human life. And it sounds like something we shouldn't do, right? The idea of deciding how much a life is worth. This is the sort of dilemma that Philip Tetlock calls a taboo trade-off. He was a researcher and psychologist, used to be here at OSU, did a lot of fantastic work. But he talked about these kind of trade-offs between what, if you'll excuse the expression, he called sacred values. Values that we considered not up for discussion, not for exchange. Things like life, the rights, liberty, friendship. Things that we don't feel comfortable making trade-offs for. But in a case with, say, an environmental protection agency, we need to be able to figure out how to make these trade-offs. But it feels wrong. I mean, we can know it's right, but that's not enough. And we feel uncomfortable, we feel disgust, we feel moral revulsion, we feel anger when we're asked to do these things. But we need to make them, and either through our action or inaction, we are implicitly making these trade-offs. So somebody needs to do the uncomfortable work of setting these prices or figuring it out so that we can move forward, no matter how unpleasant it is to make these trade-offs of emotionally laden things.
Yeah. So I have a great example of just how averse people are to considering trade-offs when the goods in question are something as sacred as human life. A few weeks ago, an article came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it was an attack on a relatively new movement called effective altruism, which, in a nutshell, you could think of as being rationality applied to altruism, to the goal of doing as much good in the world as possible. So, for example, part of effective altruism is if you're going to donate to a charity, you should try to find the charities that do the most good per dollar that you give them. So, for example, if you could, let's say you could donate to a charity that would take your money and give train a guide dog to give to one blind American. Or you could give to a different charity that would take your same amount of money and cure blindness in 2,000 people in, say, the developing world, where treatments are cheaper. So the effective altruist would say, well, these are like pretty comparable goods, except you're getting much more of one than the other. Clearly, it's better to cure 2,000 people's blindness rather than help one blind person. But the authors of this article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called this logic so cold that it would make Mr. Spock cringe upon hearing it. And they basically just objected to the idea that we should ever even think about making explicit trade-offs between things as sacred as human lives. And I found it funny that they should mention Mr. Spock because it reminded me of this trope that I encounter quite frequently. It's called the straw Vulcan. So if you've heard the term straw man, it basically means a weakened caricature of someone's argument that's easier to knock down, the same way a straw man is easier to knock down than a real live man who's fighting you. And so a straw Vulcan is a play on that. It's a weak caricature of what rationality is. And you've seen this character before. This is the character in the TV show or book or movie, like Mr. Spock on Star Trek, who is explicitly the rational one. And what that means in fiction and on the screen is that he's the one going around, raining on everyone's parade, sniffing at displays of love or emotion with the words, well, that's not logical, and basically telling everyone why they're wrong. And then, of course, at the end of the day, the world is saved not by the straw Vulcan, but instead by his sort of spontaneous, intuitive, emotional counterparts. And shows up the straw Vulcan, knocking down rationality. So a lot of the work that I have to do when I'm communicating to the public about what rationality is and why I think it's so important is just combating the stereotype of rationality. And the last maybe 50 or 60 years of cognitive science has really taken off, and a large part of what they've discovered is that the human brain has multiple ways of making decisions, multiple sort of not literal physical systems in our brain, but sort of modes of decision making, some of which could loosely be classified as emotional or intuitive or automatic, and others of which could be classified as deliberate, analytical, reflective decision making. So you could call these your heart and your head. You could call them thinking fast and slow. If you've read the excellent bestseller by Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel laureate who pioneered a lot of this research. Highly recommend that book. You could call it your Spock and your McCoy, if you like. But basically, the upshot of all this research is that our different systems, the emotional and the analytical systems, have their own strengths and weaknesses, and both are absolutely essential. So rationality, the way it's defined by cognitive scientists and the way that I use the word, doesn't mean ignoring your emotional, intuitive side and only using your analytical decision-making faculties. Officially, the definition is reflecting on what your goals are and then pursuing them as best as you possibly can. Whatever those goals are, your happiness, the happiness of other people, respect, a legacy, whatever you care about, just pursuing it in as effective a way as possible. And because both our emotional and our logical decision-making systems are essential, that's going to require using them both. So basically, today what I want to talk about is, I want to warn against two sort of parallel traps that we run into when we try to think about difficult, emotionally fraught trade-offs and decisions like the ones that Jessica was talking about. There's the trap of ignoring logic, and there's the trap of ignoring your emotions. So why is it dangerous to ignore logic and just use your emotions as a guide to what you care about and what to decide? Well, one of the main reasons is that our emotional brain doesn't know how to react to abstract information. So statistics, the results of scientific studies, large numbers in general, these just bounce off of our emotional decision-making system. We don't know how to care about them, essentially, which is a shame because that's often some of the highest quality evidence that there is that tells us what we should care about, based on our fundamental values, like promoting happiness and reducing suffering. So what is convincing to our emotional brains is anecdote and vivid story, especially personal or emotional story. And as many of you probably know, there was a false hypothesis put forward several years ago that maybe vaccination leads to autism. And there was study after reputable epidemiological study done finding, not just failing to find evidence for this, but actively finding evidence against this hypothesis. And in fact, the original paper that put forward this hypothesis was later retracted due to fraud. So there's not only no evidence for this hypothesis, but tons of evidence against it. So beyond a reasonable doubt, we can conclude this hypothesis can be rejected. And yet, scientific evidence is just not as convincing to many people as personal stories. And so there are tens of thousands of parents who have or know a child who got vaccinated and then shortly thereafter developed autism, which is what you would expect just by chance because of the timing of vaccinations in a child's life and the timing when autism tends to surface. It's what you'd expect even if there were no causal connection between the two. But to our emotional brains, that really feels like strong evidence. I mean, even I feel it. Like when I see one thing happen after another, that feels like the first thing caused the second. And if I'm emotionally invested in the situation, then all the more so. And there's a famous, what I was going to say is that you probably know that Jenny McCarthy has led the charge in favor of the vaccines cause autism hypothesis, and she has this line that she brings up whenever anyone mentions the scientific consensus, which is, "My son is my science." It's like the best or worst, depending on how you look at it, encapsulation of this mentality that personal, vivid anecdotes are better evidence than abstract scientific information. So there's this scene from one of my favorite movies, The Third Man, where Orson Welles' character, Harry Lime, has been turning a profit in post-war Vienna by selling counterfeit medicine. And as a result, hundreds of children have died from meningitis. So in this scene, he's being confronted by an old friend of his who's just learned what Harry's been up to. And they're in a Ferris wheel at a fair, and they're looking down at the fairground below. And his friend basically asks Harry, how can you live with yourself, that you're knowingly doing this? And Harry says, he leans over the edge of the Ferris wheel, looks down at the ground, and gestures at the tiny dots of people who are moving around on the ground. And he says, "Would you really feel any pity if one of these dots stopped moving forever? If I offered you 20,000 pounds for every dot that stopped moving, would you really tell me to keep my money, or would you calculate how many dots you can afford to spare?" And I hope that none of us here are in danger of becoming the next Harry Lime, but what we do share with him is an ability to feel emotionless at the prospect of large-scale loss of human life, if that information is presented to us in an abstract way, like dots on the ground, or like numbers on a newspaper page. And this problem, this general problem of our sort of ability to engage emotionally with abstract information, is compounded by another cognitive bias called scope insensitivity, which basically means that our brains can barely distinguish emotionally between numbers of differing orders of magnitude. So a friend of mine and a writer named Elias Yudkowsky has described this phenomenon well, so I'm going to quote him. He said, "The human brain cannot release enough neurotransmitters to feel emotion 1,000 times as strong as the grief of a single funeral. A prospective risk going from 10 million deaths to 100 million deaths does not multiply by 10 the strength of our determination to stop it. It merely adds one more zero on paper for our eyes to glaze over." There's actually been a lot of research to this effect, demonstrating that when you multiply the number of lives at stake by 10 or by 100, people are not willing to pay any more money to save those lives. The amount of money they're willing to donate will budge slightly sometimes, and other times, people actually are less willing to donate money to save a group of lives than a single life. They've done the study with children, asking people, would you be willing to donate money if your money could save this one child? Or would you be willing to donate money if your money could save 10 children? And people are more willing to save the one child, because one child is a face with a life and a story, and 10 children is just the number 10. There's a quote that you may have heard misattributed to Stalin that says, "One man's death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic." It's actually said by a writer named Kurt Tucholsky, but as far as the book is concerned, it was Stalin.
I don't know about you, I'm fairly depressed by the research. Both in what it means for our cognitive capacities, for what it means for our decision making, for what we actually do as human beings. But professionally, I have to deal with this as well. It's been my job for years to convince other people to support the mission of the Secular Student Alliance, to support our brand, to contribute either their time or their money or their goodwill. And I have to deal with Slovic's research saying that people care more about anecdotes and emotion. That is really what motivates them, and not the data and statistics. And I've been dealing with that for years. And it's only recently that I realized I'm a person too. I know. Even raised by economists. And maybe this has been affecting me as well. That I had avoided the danger Julia warned about, ignoring logic, and trusting only your gut. But I'd gone so far the other side, and I was ignoring emotions and ignoring the idea that maybe I could be motivated by these things as well. And I think that there's this assumption, a common one that I've had myself implicitly, that once you believe something is true, the logical parts of your brain know it, that it will immediately propagate and your emotional brain will agree and just go along with it. That you can say, I know this is an important cause, and suddenly feel passionate about everything you can do to support it. And sadly, that's not the case. There was a growing consensus in the effective altruist movement, a number of people who were trying to force themselves to take very high-paying, high-stress jobs and work long hours in order to make a lot of money to give to charity. And on its face, it sounds like a fantastic idea. You can do so much good for the world as an investment banker who gives a lot of money compared to another investment banker who would have been in your place. But the problem is that they couldn't feel the connection to the good they were doing. When you work that many hours for something you don't intrinsically care about, you don't end up feeling the motivation to really continue doing it. You see the numbers on the page of how many lives you've saved, but that doesn't convince all of our brain. There's a quote from Bertrand Russell that sums up why we need to pay so much attention to emotion. If it is supposed that I dislike emotion, or that I think anything except emotion can be a cause of action, then I most emphatically deny the charge. The world that I should wish to see is one where emotions are strong but not destructive, and where, because they are acknowledged, they lead to no deception either of oneself or others. I particularly like that last part, that we need to acknowledge our emotions so that we don't deceive ourselves. If you're not aware of your internal motivations, you can't make good decisions for what will actually be good for you in the long run. It might be uncomfortable to sit down and examine your underlying motivations. I might feel uncomfortable admitting to myself that I am motivated and care about the respect of others. I might wish that I was motivated only by a desire to be good. But it's important that we don't know these. Like the people in effective altruism who were earning to give, they burned out. And that's something that I've been struggling with and facing, being an activist who didn't connect and feel what actually motivated me and didn't have the salient stories. There's a quote from Eugene Gendlin in his book, Focusing. I'm going to read a couple lines. What is true is already so. Owning up to it doesn't make it worse. People can stand what's true, for they are already enduring it. And this is a really important part of epistemic hygiene, the idea that you want to know what's true so that you can deal with it. You're already dealing with it. If somebody is unhappy working a long job and they're unhappy, not motivated by statistics on a page, they need to know that. And by knowing it, maybe you can accommodate it. So you can possibly get both. You might be able to donate to a charity and do a lot of good and see the statistics without feeling it intrinsically, but also by reading vivid stories about the people you're helping. And that might be something that actually gets through to your emotional brain and enables you to keep going.
Yeah, so this principle is super crucial to being able to use both of your emotional and logical decision-making systems. You have to be able to know how to talk to and listen to your emotional brain. And the best advice I found for how to do that in 3 words is show, don't tell. So my friend and the co-founder of my organization with me is named Anna, and she has a story that she tells about going to the Stratosphere Hotel in Las Vegas, which is famous for offering what's called a wire-guided fall. So you basically jump off the roof of this 100-story building, but you're sort of guided by wires. So it's perfectly safe. She knew it was perfectly safe. She knew that some 40,000 people before her had taken this 100-story fall and been perfectly fine. Or rather, I should say, her logical brain knew that it was perfectly safe. Her emotional brain was petrified. So in order to convince her emotional brain of what her logical brain already believed to be true, she imagined 40,000 people jumping off the roof of the stratosphere. Or to be more concrete, she knew, okay, my college was about 20,000 people, and I remember what it looked like to see everyone assembled on the quad for graduation, this huge crowd of people, and I can sort of imagine what twice that crowd would look like. And I can imagine to myself that many people all jumped off the roof of the stratosphere and they were fine. And that sort of concrete, visual, social proof was actually quite convincing to her emotional brain, and she was able to jump off and I assume had a wonderful time. But it was the same information, just presented in a different way that her emotional brain could actually grok. And I personally, so I care a lot about rationality and believe strongly that it's important for the world, for our future, for so many reasons. But I say those words so many times that sometimes they lose their emotional meaning for me. And I just sort of forget emotionally why I care and why this is motivating to me enough that I'm like willing to spend my life doing it. So I could try talking to my emotional brain by listing statistics about how science and reason have saved lives and improved living standards over the years, all of which is true and important, and I believe it, but maybe not as salient to my emotional brain. So instead I reach for stories. And one of my trusty standby stories that always like hits the bullseye with my emotional brain is a story from Richard Dawkins about an experience he had when he was studying in the zoology department at Oxford. So at the time, there was a controversy in zoology over this alleged cellular structure called the Golgi apparatus, which is distributes macromolecules around the cell. But at the time, people weren't sure if it actually existed or if it was just an artifact of measurement or observation. It was actually illusory. So there was this elderly professor in the department who was famous for his position that the Golgi apparatus was not real. It was illusory. And one day, while Dawkins was there, a visiting professor came to give a talk at Oxford in which he presented new and very compelling evidence the Golgi apparatus was in fact real. And so, of course, throughout this talk, everyone's looking over their shoulders at the elderly professor going, what's he gonna say? And at the end of the talk, the elderly professor gets up, walks to the front of the lecture hall, and extends his hand to the visiting professor and says, "My dear fellow, I wish to thank you. I've been wrong these 15 years. And Dawkins describes how the auditorium burst out into applause, and he says, "The memory of this incident still brings a lump to my throat." And I will be honest, it brings a lump to my throat as well every time I recall it or tell it. That's the kind of person who I want to be, and the kind of person who I want making important decisions for our world, and the kind of person who I want to inspire other people to be. That motivates my brain, my emotional brain, more than statistics about the cost of rational decision making or the benefits of rationality.
One of my stories that speaks to my emotional part of my brain for doing good that I know analytically is important is something about Brother Jed Bingo. It's something, Brother Jed is an open-air preacher notorious for traveling around the country from campus to campus, spewing the most bigoted, hateful, and aggressive messages that you can think of. And a lot of campuses are trying to figure out what to do. The secular students in particular have found a fun solution. When Brother Jed comes to their campus, and sometimes he announces where it is, sometimes people spot him and send out the alert that he beamed. One of them will hold up a huge sign with a list of the common, ridiculous or hateful things that Brother Jed says. Another secular student will pass out bingo cards with these different ideas. And passersby and members of the onlookers will now have a fun game to play. So suddenly this potentially hostile and aggressive situation has turned into something fun. Students are looking up, looking down, looking up, listening, checking off, and occasionally raising their hand saying, bingo. So I love this. This is the kind of cleverness that it just fills me with glee, almost, when I hear this kind of brilliance, because they've found a way to make it fun. They found a way to do good while really finding a way that motivates them as students and connect with me. But particularly, I was talking with Derek, who's a leader of the Illini Secular Student Alliance. His group did it, they sent in pictures, and I had a conversation with him, asking, where did you get the idea? It's brilliant. And he said, oh, I didn't come up with it. We actually heard it at the Secular Student Alliance conference last year. The University of Minnesota group was telling us about it, and it just sounded so much fun that we had to do it. So I asked the University of Minnesota group and their leaders where they'd come up with the idea. And they said that they didn't know, but they'd heard it from another group leader the year before at the conference. And that's when something clicked. And I realized that I pictured like electricity arcing across students across the country. That when one student has a clever idea, something really motivating and inspiring that connects your emotional motivations with doing good intellectually, it can spread, sparking a chain reaction to students across the country. And that's what I see in community. The mission of the Secular Student Alliance says that we organize, unite, educate, and serve our students and student communities. I've said it a lot, I've read it a lot, but the unite part doesn't usually hit me as emotionally. The idea that it's so important to connect the students to something larger. But hearing the story from Derek about these connections that they form when they come to the Secular Student Alliance conference, hundreds of them pouring into OSU to become friends, to motivate each other, to provide reinforcement. I mean, that's what communities can do. They can inspire the best in each other. They can embody the values we want to see. We can recognize the good work that we've done. Congratulations to Doug for everything. And that's why I donate to the Humanist community of Central Ohio. This is why I'm part of the Secular Student Alliance, forming grassroots connections across the country. This is why I want to see more grassroots communities thrive for secular Americans. And while we definitely inspire each other, one thing I do want to impart to all of you is that you also inspire others outside of Columbus. I'm so proud of everything we have here and know that we act as a role model to others around the country who can see what can happen when humanists come together and secular Americans form a community and really promote these kind of values, both head and heart working together to make the world a better place.
So this is the single other most important piece of advice that I would give you about trying to have a positive impact on the world, which is don't try to do it alone. Staying connected to a community of people who share your values, things that you're passionate about, is the best way to help yourself help the world, in addition to understanding your emotional brain and how to listen to it and how to talk to it. We are social animals. We are primates, and to a large extent, we mimic the behavior and values of the people around us. That's what we evolved to do. And I've been struck by how clearly I can see this phenomenon in myself when I compare myself now to, Julia 5 years ago, say. There are a bunch of things that I knew then logically that I wanted to do. Like I wanted to be more proactive about helping the world. I wanted to figure out how to sort of spread the rationality that I thought was important, and to help me do those things. I wanted to get better at trying things and taking risks, even if I'm going to fail a lot of the time. But in practice, what did I do? Well, I read a lot of blog posts about helping the world and about trying things from the comfort of my own living room. And it was only after I started, a couple years later, surrounding myself with people, creating my own community and also plugging myself into communities that existed, who were working hard on projects to change the world for the better, that I found myself caring more on an emotional level. And the idea of getting up and trying things, starting some project that I thought could maybe make a difference, just seemed realer. It just seemed like a real thing I could do, rather than some abstract possibility that I just never felt like I could act on. My logical brain knew it all along. I didn't get new information. But my emotional brain didn't get it until I had these social examples. And you have the choice of who you want to surround yourself with. You can choose to surround yourself with people who inspire you, who are working towards similar goals and striving towards the same values of altruism and truth-seekingness and rationality that you also want to strive towards. People who you can not only look to for inspiration, but who are going to look to you for inspiration, which I think is just as motivating as the other direction. And at least you can choose to surround yourself with these communities if they exist, which is why my organization cares so much about building community and why I'm so happy that the humanist and secular movements are too. So what Jesse and I would like you to take away from this conversation today is that we have many difficult trade-offs we're facing in today's world. And more than ever before in our history as a species, we have decisions that we face that our brains did not evolve to make well. Our emotional brain didn't evolve to feel moved by statistics or by the suffering of strangers across the world who we will never see or interact with. It didn't evolve to comprehend numbers like 100 million or like 0.1% or the distant future. And yet, somehow we have to make these very high-stakes decisions about the environment, about global warming, nuclear proliferation, social policy, research into rare diseases and antibiotics, political decisions that will affect billions of people in the generations to come. And we have to make these decisions somehow with the amazing but imperfect hardware that we have sitting in our skulls. And we will never be perfect at making decisions. We will always make mistakes. But we can and we should do much better using both logic and emotion. Thank you.